I was driving home after work one day and there was a big thunderstorm coming in. I'm the type of person who really hates getting wet. I tried to avoid it at all costs, so I was driving a little faster than I should have been. About halfway through the drive though, the rain finally decided to come down, and it came down hard. The second half of the drive was unbearable. The rain did not let up and my windshield wipers were going crazy, but my visibility was still poor. I had to drive very slowly. When I made it to my apartment complex, it was still raining hard. My parking space was in a spot that I could see my apartment, but it was across the lot, so I would get completely soaked if I got out to go inside. I wanted to avoid that, so I decided to wait in the car for the rain to let up. I know this might seem weird to some people. It would make sense for me to be able to just dry off and change once I got into my apartment, but I decided to wait instead, because that's how badly I didn't want to get wet, as I hated the feeling. It wasn't cold out, so I just turned the car off and waited inside. I may have been waiting in the car for about 20 minutes when some movement caught my eye up by the apartment building. I almost didn't believe what I was seeing, and I had to do a double take to make sure. My apartment door opened up and two men exited from my apartment. They were carrying some things with them, things that they were taking from my apartment. I was too shocked to really do anything at first, and I wondered if I should try to confront them, but I realized that would probably be dangerous. I eventually ended up taking out my cell phone and I called the police. It was odd to tell them that I was sitting in my car in the rain watching two people rob my home. The police arrived quickly. I had seen the robbers go away from the area my apartment was in, so it wasn't hard for the police to find them and capture them. Once they did, the officers came to talk to me about what happened. It had stopped raining at this point, and the officers walked me over to my apartment. They told me that I was pretty lucky that I had waited in the car. When the two guys were searched, they were found to be carrying several knives. Apparently, they were suspected in other robberies and a knife attack on a senior citizen in the area. My fear of getting wet may have saved me from an attack. I was in that car for at least 20 minutes waiting for the thunderstorm to end. If I had gone in before then, I would have walked into an attempted robbery, and who knows what might have happened if I did. One afternoon, I got caught in a thunderstorm that led me to a scary situation. I needed to head to the local grocery store for pet food, and I also decided I would pick up dinner for myself from there as well. I have a car, but I don't care to use it too much since I prefer walking to most places. I get good exercise, and it's usually a good experience. The grocery store was a good 40-minute walk from where I live, so I left the store in the early afternoon. It was warm out and the sky was completely clear when I left. In fact, the entire time that I was walking to the store, it was nice outside. I got to the store, purchased a few items I needed, then put them in my backpack that I always carry with me. When I left the store, I was surprised by the sudden change of weather. The clear and sunny day had vanished and was replaced by a blanket of black clouds. I hadn't bothered to check the weather before leaving the house. It was so bright and sunny outside before that I didn't think I needed to, but it now looked like it could begin storming at any moment. Well, I started walking out of the parking lot, and I walked fast. Even walking quickly, it would take me at least 30 minutes to get back to my house. I couldn't run because I didn't have good shoes for that. I had a backpack on, and overall, I just wasn't a runner. I tried to hurry as much as I could though. I had made it part of the way home, but then the thunderstorm began. There was nowhere nearby for me to take refuge as the sky began to dump sheets of rain on me. It happened so quickly, and I was completely drenched in probably less than a minute. I barely even heard it approaching through the rain, but a truck pulled over, and the man in the truck asked me if I wanted a ride. I told him that I was soaked and wet and would just get his car wet as well. He insisted, however, and eventually I gave in and I got in the truck. Now, rather than take me home, the guy just kept the truck where it was and then began talking to me. He told me that he had seen me many times, walking up and down the main street, and had always wondered if I had a car. I told him that I did, and I just explained how I enjoyed walking, and I hadn't checked the weather for the day. Finally, he took off driving. Instead of turning into my neighborhood where I directed him to, though, he pulled into a truck stop. My first thought was that he needed to get gas or buy something, but he drove around and parked in the far back of the lot. I was about to ask him what was going on, when he turned to me and abruptly said, You know, you could take your clothes off and you wouldn't be so wet," as he placed his hand on my knee. I responded that I was fine and could change at home, asking what we were doing there and if he could please just bring me home. The man continued to stare at me and eventually said that we could just hang out for a while until the thunderstorm was over. I was feeling very uncomfortable. I had thought that this had been an act of someone being a good Samaritan, but it was clear to me now that it wasn't. I felt around for the door handle on my side, but I realized it wasn't there. I couldn't open the door and get away. The man pushed himself closer to me, and I had to find a way out of that terrifying situation. Instinctively, I did the only thing I could think of, and I punched him in the crotch as hard as I could. He screamed in agony, and that was my chance. It was disgusting, but I crawled over the guy. He kept trying to grab me, but I was able to crawl over him and open his door and get out of the truck. Slipping around on the wet pavement, I managed to run into the truck stop, even though I didn't have good running shoes. I alerted the cashier in the gas station to call the police. The guy drove off before the police got there, but they were able to pick him up later due to the description I gave them. Turns out the guy had been in jail several times for doing what he tried to do to me. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to convict him just based on what I testified to, but I was able to get a restraining order on him. For a while afterward, it was difficult to walk out on the street. Every time a car passed by, out of the corner of my eye, I saw that truck and I got afraid. One night, there was a huge thunderstorm where I lived. The storm was raging to the point where it was scary, as trees were swaying and there was just a ton of wind and rain. I was home alone that night. My wife and kids were visiting her parents, and I was left to weather the storm by myself. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded relentlessly against the windows. The power had gone out a few hours earlier, leaving me in near total darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning. I was sitting in the living room, really just trying to stay calm. I had lit a few candles and used a small flashlight to help me see inside. I was trying to read a book, but the howling wind and the constant flash of lightning made it difficult to concentrate. Around midnight, I was sitting in the dark when I noticed a flash of lightning illuminate the backyard. In that brief burst of light, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a figure standing just outside the back door near the edge of the porch. The lightning lit up the area briefly, and I saw a shadowy shape standing still. Staring at the spot, scared to move or take my eyes off of it, I just sat there, silent. When the lightning struck again, the figure was gone. I told myself it was probably just a trick of light, or my imagination playing games with me. I got up and walked to the back door to check. I scanned the yard with the flashlight, but there was nothing out there as far as I could tell. I went back to the living room and I tried to focus on my book again, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard a soft knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and with the storm, it seemed odd that somebody would be out there. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything. The porch light was out, and the only illumination came from the occasional lightning flash. I hesitated before deciding to open the door. I didn't want to be a victim of some sort of prank or worse, but curiosity got the better of me. Opening the door a crack, I peered outside. There was no one there. I closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off everything which had happened to me so far as just a figment of my imagination and distress caused by the thunderstorm. I decided to check the windows to make sure everything was secure. As I walked past the front window, I saw something out of the corner of my eye though. A figure stood near the edge of the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. It was a person, but their face was obscured by the darkness and the rain. They seemed to be standing still, watching my house. The lightning illuminated the scene for a split second, and I saw what looked like a hooded raincoat. There was absolutely zero reason why anybody should be standing there right now in a storm that was this bad. I backed away from the window and tried to think of what to do. I considered calling the police, but I hesitated, thinking it might just be a case of paranoia because of the storm. I decided to wait a few minutes and see if the figure would move or do anything unusual. I watched from the shadows of my house, hoping that the figure would leave. After what felt like an eternity, the lightning flashed again, and I saw the figure take a few steps towards my house. I was paralyzed with fear as I fumbled quickly with my phone and was ready to call the police. The figure stopped at the edge of the yard, as if contemplating something. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the storm. I waited a while longer to make sure that they were really gone, and I was fully freaked out at this point. I locked all the doors and windows again, double-checking everything. I spent the rest of the night on edge, waiting to see if the figure would appear again anywhere near my house. The storm eventually ended early that morning, and I felt much more relieved as the sun began to come up, and there was no sign of the mysterious person anywhere. One weekend in the middle of the summer, my friends and I planned a weekend trip to go to a cabin. My friends and I had rented it for a break from our busy lives. The cabin was in a remote spot by a lake surrounded by trees. We didn't think much of it when we noticed the weather report predicting thunderstorms. Even if it did rain for most of the weekend, we could still have a great time hanging out inside the cabin. We arrived Friday evening and settled into the small but cozy cabin. We had planned to spend the weekend fishing, playing board games, and cooking meals together. The storm rolled in later that night. At first, it was just a light drizzle, but by midnight, the rain was coming down hard, and the wind was howling through the trees. We were playing cards in the living room as the storm ragged on outside. The power flickered a couple of times, but it stayed on. The storm grew stronger, and the lightning flashes became more frequent. Around 2 a.m., the power went out completely, and it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning. We lit some candles and kept playing cards, trying to keep the mood light. There was no way to charge our phones, so we were cut off from the outside world. At some point, we heard a loud bang from outside. We all looked at each other, uneasy, wondering if a tree branch or something had fallen and hit the house. One of my friends, Mark, suggested that we check it out. We grabbed a flashlight and headed out onto the porch. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was so strong it felt like it might blow us over. We shined the flashlight around, but couldn't see anything like a fallen limb from a tree, but we just assumed that it was something that had been caused by the storm. We went back inside and tried to forget about it and huddled around the fireplace talking. As we sat there, someone knocked on the door to the cabin. It was strange because we hadn't seen any cars on the road, and it was impossible for anyone else to be out in this weather. We all exchanged nervous glances. Mark, being the bravest of us all, went to the door and opened it a crack. There was nobody there, just the rain and the wind. We shrugged it off and assumed it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But then, a few minutes later, the knocking started again, louder this time. It was a repetitive, constant knock, like somebody was trying to get our attention. Mark, still determined to prove there was nothing to worry about, went to open the door again. This time, he stood outside for a moment, and when he came back inside from the porch, he was pale. "There's something out there," he said. "I saw a figure standing by the edge of the lake." None of us really believed him. The storm was so intense, it was hard to see anything clearly. The storm raged on, and with Mark's persuasion, who was still freaking out saying he saw something out by the lake, we decided to barricade the door just in case. We piled furniture in front of it and tried to get some sleep for the rest of the night. In the early hours of the morning, we heard a sound that none of us could explain. It was like a dragging noise, moving around the cabin. We huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep now. The dragging sound seemed to be circling the cabin, slowly and deliberately. At first light, we ventured outside once the storm had passed. We looked around, but there was nothing unusual and we saw no footprints or sign of anybody else being there. We decided to pack up and leave. The atmosphere had become too unsettling, and Mark was still insisting that he saw something creepy out there last night. As we were loading the car, I noticed something strange. The knock marks on the door were much deeper than before, like somebody had tried to break in. We left the cabin and didn't return. To this day, none of us can explain the knocking, the dragging noise, or the figure by the lake. We try to put it behind us, but the memory of that stormy night still lingers. It was a typical fall morning when the storm hit. Heavy wind and rain began going on all day. My family and I had settled in for the night, thinking that we were safe and sound, but around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by an enormous crash. The house shook, and I could hear the sound of something heavy landing with a thud. We rushed downstairs to find that a large tree had fallen on the house. It had crashed through the roof and into our living room, right where the sofa used to be. The rain, which was fairly light now, was coming in through the broken roof, and there was debris everywhere. We quickly called emergency services and then checked to make sure everybody was okay. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. It was a chaotic scene as the fire department arrived and started to assess the damage. After making sure the house was safe, they left us to clean up. It was a mess, and we took all the next day to clean up, but we were grateful that nobody had been in the living room at the time. As we started to clean up, we noticed something odd though. Under the debris and wreckage, there was a section of the floor that seemed to be different. It wasn't just the damage from the tree. It felt like something was underneath the floor. My husband and I cleared away more of the wreckage and discovered a small door. It was hidden beneath some loose floorboards and had a rusty latch. We were both curious, and I remember feeling a chill, but we decided to open it. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a small dark room below. We shone a flashlight into it. The room was tiny, barely big enough for one person to stand in. It was filled with old, dusty objects. There were old newspapers, boxes, and an assortment of what looked like forgotten junk. But as we looked closer, we found some unsettling things. Among the newspapers, there were old photographs, grainy black and white images of people who we didn't recognize. Some of the people's faces had been torn or scratched off. There was also a collection of rusty knives and other sharp objects that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. The last disturbing find was a small locked metal box. It was covered in dust and looked very old. We tried to open it, but couldn't get it to budge. The box had a faded label on it, but the writing was too worn to read. We called the police to report the hidden room. They came over and took a look, and then called in a specialist to investigate. They were just as intrigued and unnerved by the discovery. The specialist took the box for further examination, and the rest of the items were cataloged. We didn't get much information from the police, but they told us that the room and its contents were being investigated. They did tell us that there were no records of the room on the blueprints of the house, and it must have been added by an older owner at some point. The tree had caused a lot of damage, but it also led to the discovery of the room. The hidden room remains a mystery, and we never learned much more about it or its contents. I still don't know.